Hi there, I'm Raj, and today we're going to talk about the Cold War, specifically the government and regime of the Soviet Union at that time. The Cold War lasted between 1946 and 1991 and was recognized as the power struggle between the US and the USSR to spread their own ideologies. The Red Army had created a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, dominating the regions that they pushed down the Nazis. This created, as Winston Churchill put, an iron curtain in between Europe, separating the capitalists from the communists. Some historians say that the Cold War began right after the end of World War II, at the time the atomic bomb was dropped to intimidate the Russians, which it did and led to them creating their own in 1949, starting the arms race. From the beginning, the US had the fair advantage, with more money and power and support from Europe, whereas the USSR had to rebuild itself. And also, they had the disadvantage of being led by this noted morons, Joseph Stalin. And yes, he was an idiot. Stalin abolished all ideas related to Leninism to spread his own form of communism throughout the Soviet Union and its satellites as soon as he gained power in 1922. These included the 5-year plan, which basically placed all the responsibility of determining exactly what and how much 220 million people needed for the next 5 years in the hands of a few politicians. Let's see what we have in the thought bubble, shall we? In America we have this. Fidget spinners. Fidget spinners. This is exactly the kind of useless goods sold in the US that would have never been produced in the USSR, and it is because of how much more we spent on consumer spendings on stuff like fidget spinners that we won the Cold War. The scene from the famous Robin Williams movies, Moscow on the Hudson, shows how a Russian man would typically feel after coming to an American store like Walmart after being given the same stuff for the past 30 years of his life.
Coffee? I'll too. Coffee lime, please. I'll too. No lime, though. Taster's choice, decaffeinated, Maxwell House, with El Pico, chock full of nuts, espresso, cappuccino, cafe francais, Sanka, Volga, cafe Carib, coffee, 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 coffee.
Thanks, Thought Bubble. Another idea of Stalinism was collectivization, which forced farmers to combine land and grow what the government said so that they could take all the crops away and distribute some while wasting the rest. This led to a great famine, killing over 13 million people. Suppression of people of culture and nationalities like the Jews and Ukrainians wasn't great either. And no one liked driving a Yugo. Dear Stalin, no one likes you. On the top 10 people hated in this world according to some website I found, you're ranked number 3, below Hitler and above Saddam. Good job. There were social movements in place like Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, but they were soon shut down by the Russian military.
But didn't the USSR help a lot of countries get back on their feet after the World War?
You're so innocent, young me. The Soviet Union aided its satellite states to keep their sphere of influence under the Warsaw Pact, even though the nations under control hated the Russians. The USSR had to spend a whole lot of money on these countries, which later led to its decline. But probably the most important factor which led to the end of the Cold War was this guy. Mikhail Gorbachev's Perestroika and Glasnost opened up political and economic systems which contested local elections, less restricted civil society groups, less censorship, more autonomy for the Soviet republics, more non-state run businesses, and more autonomy for state-run farms. Glasnost, or openness, led to more information from the West, and less censorship led to a flood of criticism as people realized how much poorer the Second World War than the First World, and one by one, often quite suddenly, former communist states collapsed. In Germany, the Berlin Wall came down in 1989 and reunited in 1990. In Poland, the Gdańsk Dock Workers Union Solidarity turned into a mass political movement and won 99 out of the 100 seats it was allowed to contest in the 1989 election. Hungary held multi-party elections in 1999. The same year, mass demonstrations led to an elections in Czechoslovakia in 1993. That country split up into Slovakia and Czech Republic, the happiest and most mutually beneficial divorce. Of course, sometimes the transition away from communism was violent and painful. In Romania, for instance, the communist dictator Ceausescu held onto power until he was put before firing squad at the end of 1989 and took until 1996 for a non-communist government to take power there. And in Yugoslavia, not so great. And Russia? You see what I'm putting? But Gorbachev did accomplish the partial breakdown of Stalinism that had been going on for 50 years and did bring back some of the capitalist ideas first proposed by Lenin way back in the 1920s.